Today's session is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Thank you very much. On behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to today's session. A brief word about logistics and we'll be off. We ask that if you are not already on mute, to please keep your phone on mute for the duration of today's presentation. As mentioned, the session is being recorded and muting all lines will help us to avoid any background noise. We encourage questions. They can be submitted using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Please type your question in the provided field and hit submit. Feel free to submit your question at any time, but we will be opening the session for questions when the presentation is finished. Without any further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the meeting over to Dr. David Chambers.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We are intending primarily to give as much time as possible to both orient everyone to the Dissemination, Implementation, Research, and Health program announcements that we at NIH issued back in May, and then to offer as much time as possible for questions and answers. So the goal really of this is to try and give you an opportunity to make sure that you're aware both of these announcements, but also of any particulars that are affecting your decision-making process in terms of submitting. And however we can help, this is always the starting of a dialogue rather than the finale. And so we'd encourage you for the program announcement, you'll have contacts from each of the individual institutes and centers and offices that participate from across the NIH. We'd encourage you to follow up with those who are most relevant to the topic that you're thinking about. So just to give you a sense, if anyone who is on the webinar is not as familiar with the NIH structure, we are National Institutes of Health, meaning that we're comprised of 27 different institutes and centers. Those institutes and centers, as well as offices, are organized by different disease areas. So you'll see here the National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Deafness and Communication Disorders, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. There's also other institutes that focus more along biological systems, the eye, dental and craniofacial. We have other institutes that focus more on subpopulations, the Child Health and Human Development, National Institute on Aging, Minority Health and Health Disparities, as well as the Fogarty International Center. And then there are a few other institutes across the and centers across the NIH that are focusing more on the resources to conduct a wide range of different scientific applications, bioinformatics, and translational research broadly as examples of those. So the institutes and centers typically have the intramural programs where we have labs where our investigators are conducting research themselves, but much of the money goes to the extramural community that many of you represent, where we're supporting, through program announcements like this one, research. We fund it, but it's of course being conducted across the country, across the globe, et cetera. And most of the grants really come down to the major research project grant mechanisms. The R01s are the bigger ones, the R03s, the small grant programs, R21s are more of that exploratory developmental research, as well as contracts. So to orient you to dissemination and implementation research, I'm pulling up a graphic that came from a paper that was published in 2007 that basically said for a while we were really focusing on these different and relatively few translational hurdles. We were usually focusing as a broad biomedical research community in the translation ultimately from the basic science and the basic research toward the ultimate use of those findings, of scientific findings, into practice. And more traditionally, as you'll see at the top of this diagram, we identified that there were these two key blocks. There was this Translation Research 1, which was focusing on how do we take some of those basic findings and turn them into clinical applications. We then had this sort of catch-all Translational Research Type 2 that was more focused on how do we get from a clinical research application to that becoming standard care across the system. Now, a number of years ago, 9 years ago in this case, there was a recognition that there's more to it than that. It's not just about going from this sort of bedside initial application to broad-scale policy and practice. But there is this whole other challenge of how, once we get the evidence in order through our effectiveness trials, through our development of guidelines, how do we understand the way in which those products of research can make their way into policy and practice environments? And in this case, it was seen as this third translational hurdle and was known as dissemination and implementation research. This is one of the earlier mentions where alongside of other translational research, there was this notion that dissemination and implementation research are these very important and not to be confused from these other translational hurdles. Actually earlier this year, there was a recognition that potentially the translational continuum is even broader than that. So this came out of Uche Sampson and others' paper in Global Heart this year, talking about even more translational hurdles, that we have this idea of the basic science again, then we go through our initial translation into sort of those first in-human studies for those clinical applications, this idea that then we need to think about the more more controlled way of making sure that that gets to patients and addresses clinical needs. Then the idea that it scales up a little bit more where you have your larger clinical trials and your comparative effectiveness, and then you have this idea again of dissemination and implementation research. So at different points along the way, there's been a recognition that the path from research to practice is increasingly complex, and we don't do well when we make assumptions that we can simply just jump over various hurdles. In both of these ways of trying to frame the translational continuum, you'll see that dissemination and implementation research is front and center in terms of trying to make the largest possible impact of our research on practice, on policy, on healthcare, and on health. So the history of the program announcements that we've now had for over 10 years came with a recognition on the part of individual institutes and centers that this was a challenge, that we weren't doing enough to develop the knowledge base around the dissemination of evidence and scientific findings and the implementation of effective practices into various community and clinical settings. And so we started to see individual institutes say, we need to have some more work in this area. In 2004, 2005, there was an opportunity to really try to connect the dots as much as possible across these different health topics. There had been a group of people at NIH who were facilitated by the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research that were all struggling with these latter phases of translational research. And we decided that we could take some of those initial institute center specific announcements that the NIMH and NCI had been developing and others had been developing, NIDDK as well, and try and say, how can we shape an announcement that cuts across NIH? In 2005, the first round of those program announcements that this is now the descendant of came out with 8 different institutes and centers. 4 years later, when we issued the second round, there were now 12 institutes and centers that were involved. At the same time, we started to launch these larger meetings around the state of the science for dissemination and implementation. And then we also, a few years later, again with OBSSR leading along with some of our fellow institutes, we established a training institute on dissemination and implementation research in health that we've now had for 5 years and are modifying it, but are going to hold the 6th one in December. And then 3 years ago, the third time around for the program announcements, we had 15 institutes and centers signed on. So with each iteration of these announcements, we've been able to see more interest across the institutes and centers to try and say, how do we come together around a shared scientific agenda, which is what we'd all love to see, that the knowledge base in one area is going to be as useful as possible to understanding dissemination and implementation research overall. So you'll see here the participation. This is sort of the word salad or the abbreviations that we often use at the National Institutes of Health. The RO1 has the many institutes and centers you'll see represented here. National Cancer Institute has been the lead, but we've been incredibly grateful to have such strong participation from so many of the institutes that you see here. The R21 has slightly fewer representative institutes and centers, and the RO3 slightly fewer than that. And that, again, is based on the fact that different institutes and centers allow or prioritize the use of different mechanisms. So everybody pretty much has the RO1, but for the RO3s and the R21s, there are certain institutes that just don't use that particular mechanism. And so it's usually correlated to whether the institute commonly looks at that mechanism as something that they'll turn to or not. And so you'll see a slightly different set of folks who are involved in the different announcements. It's also notable that you'll see the Office of Disease Prevention, ODP, and OBSSR, the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, represented on each of these announcements, but note that they are not able to hold grants. So typically they coordinate a lot of work across the institutes, and they can often co-fund, but they wouldn't be the host organization for a particular grant. So you need to look at the different institutes and centers and say, which of these that can hold grants is going to be the best fit for my particular study. So what is the purpose of what we're trying to do? So you'll see here, it's really thinking about newer ways of identifying, understanding, and developing a whole range of strategies that are trying to overcome barriers to the different outcomes that we're trying to achieve with dissemination and implementation. So we think about the adoption, the adaptation, integration, scale-up, and sustainability of evidence-based interventions, tools, policies, and guidelines. So there's a whole range of different things that have developed out of research and can very much benefit health and healthcare that we want to see adopted, integrated, scaled up, sustained, and even adapted where necessary to fit the particular settings. At the same time, we want to make sure that we don't lose the need to think about what should not be delivered. And so there's a real opportunity to think about developing the knowledge base where we need to not implement but de-implement or reduce the use of strategies and interventions that are not evidence-based or may have been prematurely widely adopted, are not delivering on the benefits that they should, that patients should deserve, or are harmful and wasteful. So it's really important here that we're thinking about dissemination and implementation research as that entire continuum, and includes what also should we not be doing anymore to make space, in a sense, for what we should be implementing. We, from the beginning, proposed definitions within our announcements to try and anchor investigators into how at least we're approaching these different areas. From the beginning, we talked about what dissemination and implementation are to us. And here you'll see we modified it slightly just to anchor it around dissemination research and implementation research, since those are the key terms for the announcement. You'll see dissemination research here defined as studying the targeted distribution of information and different intervention materials to particular audiences. So too often we assume that we're very good at being able to communicate our research findings, to spread them in a way that anyone can take them up. But with the variety of different target audiences, the variety of different applications, we really need to do a better job of understanding that connection and that process of how our evidence and our various interventions are shaped and transmitted and then received and then acted upon. We also are very interested in the implementation research side of things, which here you'll see we define as the use of strategies to adopt and integrate evidence-based health interventions into clinical and community settings to try and improve patient outcomes and benefit population health. As I said before, our definition, or I'll say here, our definition of interventions is pretty broad. So it can be a specific program, it can be a specific medication, it can be a psychosocial intervention, it can be a multi-level systemic intervention, it can be around diagnostic. The idea is this is something that has been seen, that has been shown to have individual benefit when delivered on health and healthcare. And the idea is to say, how do we get that to as many people as can benefit? And how do we really work more intensively understanding the local context in which care or programs are delivered so that we can optimize the use of those interventions and ultimately improve both patient outcomes and a broader population health. So on the dissemination research side, again, we're thinking about all aspects of that dissemination process, how the evidence is created, how it's packaged, how it's transmitted, how it's received, and then how it's turned into action at the local level. And so the challenge here is that we've often assumed that we can do this very well, but we need to develop the knowledge base given the variety of different audiences and contexts so that we know that our effective interventions are made aware to those who can benefit from them, and how that information is helpful in making decisions about whether to incorporate them into their workflows and into their lives. On the implementation side, we really try and draw this contrast between what we've often seen as the usual way of thinking about interventions and their impact on individuals to focusing on what we mean when we're talking about implementation. So what you'll see here is the left and the right end, we're often focusing on what do we deliver to the individual patient so that we can have our benefits in terms of health outcomes for those individuals who get that particular intervention. So the QI here is quality improvements, the EST here is empirically supported treatments, and the idea is that if we focus on what do we do for that individual, we're ideally getting satisfaction, getting improved function, improved health status, reduction of symptoms, and that's kind of the way that we've focused a lot of our clinical trials. But when we do that, we end up jumping over the how, and this is really the core of implementation research. How do we get those effective practices to be delivered? And we think about some of our implementation outcomes, things like feasibility and fidelity, things about like penetration, the acceptability of the intervention, how can it be sustained, what does it cost to try and implement it, and what level of uptake does it have? Our assumption here is that if we get the outcomes right, if we get the implementation strategies that get our interventions to be delivered, and we get those outcomes, we show that we can do it with high quality, we show that these practices can be sustained, that ultimately what we're going to see is a knock-on benefit to the service system, and you'll see here the IOM standards of care. These were the common from the Crossing the Quality Chasm report, common metrics for whether health services and service systems are performing well. We're going to see improvements in safety and effectiveness overall, and equity and patient-centeredness, et cetera, and then we would have a knock-on benefit at a population level in terms of health outcomes. So while our core of implementation research is in saying what are the implementation strategies that are going to lead to better uptake, better sustainability, et cetera, ultimately we're going to be happiest if we see that implementation research ultimately results in those better service systems and then those better health outcomes overall. There are a few common things that we have learned and that we have seen in the development of dissemination and implementation research that we stress here. There's a whole range of different theories, there's a whole range of different findings, and a whole range of different methods that we borrow from a whole variety of fields. So this is very much an inter and a multidisciplinary group, and those who have engaged in the field come from all walks of sort of academic as well as clinical as well as community and other disciplines. It also often requires collaboration with stakeholders across multiple practice settings. It requires that a range of different methodological approaches, and what we try and stress is that find the most rigorous and the most relevant approach for your particular question and your particular context in which you're asking that question. So we see observational work, we see experimental work, we see quasi-experimental work, we even see a fair amount of system science approaches like simulation modeling, and we'd love to see more. But it's not that there's a one-size-fits-all methodology for all of the studies that we see. There's also a need, and particularly we reference this in this program announcement, to go beyond the did it work? Were we successful in our dissemination or our implementation efforts? What we really want to make sure that we take advantage of is the opportunity to learn about how and why they work. So in the same way that a lot of our intervention studies have moved much more into mechanistic looks at the intervention and looks at moderators and mediators, we would love to see the same for our dissemination and implementation strategies and our dissemination and implementation studies. So I'm going to go through just highlighting a couple of the topics. You'll see in the announcement a whole range of different selected research topics, and so I'll just briefly highlight those. You, of course, should use the program announcements as your reference point, since those will have even a few more than that. And you'll see here that they focus on a whole range of things within dissemination as well as implementation research. Again, echoing every part of the transmission and reception of health research knowledge, focusing on dissemination of different strategies to try and promote effective patient and caregiver communication, the whole range of strategies that are needed in order to implement all types of interventions, whether it's health promotion, prevention, screening, early detection, and diagnostics, the effective treatments, clinical procedures, or guidelines within existing care systems. So seeing intervention as a very broad concept. And then recognizing that we're not just focusing necessarily on one evidence-based practice or one intervention at a time, but really needing more work that says, how do we implement a whole range of evidence-based practices that are going to meet the needs of complex patients, diverse systems of care that may not only be focused on one particular condition or one particular symptom or one particular problem. Moving forward, we're interested in seeing more work looking at the local adaptation of evidence-based practices while being implemented. This is something that we really don't have much work on. So we know from empirical and anecdotal data that a lot of evidence-based practices are being adapted when they hit a range of community and clinical settings. And we're not doing a good job of learning from those efforts to try to locally adapt them, and we'd love to see more. We'd certainly love to see more around sustainability. We'd love to see more around dissemination and implementation strategies that are trying to reduce health disparities and improve quality of care, particularly for underserved populations. And as referenced below, we're not just wanting to see how do we bring more in, but how do we de-implement clinical and community practices that are not meeting the needs of those who they're intended to serve. And then across dissemination and implementation broadly, we'd love to see not only development of models, but we'd love to see more of the testing of the different dissemination and implementation process models that have been developed over the last year. We have a lot more development and articulation than we have testing of those. We'd still love to see more in terms of relevant outcome and process measures being developed and validated so that they're of use to the broader field. We'd love to see, and we're increasingly excited to see more of those who are focusing on genomics and genomic medicine say, what can we learn about dissemination and implementation, or how do we improve the way in which genomic medicine and other related areas are incorporated within day-to-day clinical practice. And you'll see that from the second one, whether it's the particular testing, diagnostics, therapeutics, or it's really the way in which genomic information, family history, risk information, other information is used to try and improve diagnosis and treatment. There are a few, what we say in the program announcement, a few common features across dissemination implementation research studies. Usually there's a benefit in using conceptual models within your study that are appropriate for dissemination implementation, that you've showed that you understand some of the incentives or the barriers to having clinical or community practice change, that you are trying to identify the mediators, the moderators, as well as mechanisms of action that are helping you to say how and why these different strategies may or may not work. Ideally, this is a way to learn from every study, whether positive or negative. Usually some recognition that context is often multi-level, and how we're trying to understand features of context and how it influences dissemination implementation is very important. That there's the development, as I said on the previous slide, and use of applicable outcomes measures and analyses, and then potentially where those outcomes, those measures don't exist, is it an opportunity to build new validated ones? And then importantly, the way in which our research, if done well, is going to be as relevant to the variety of stakeholders in our community and our clinical systems as possible. So thinking about what are the outcomes that are going to be most important to patients, to families, to providers, to administrators, payers, policymakers, is going to be very important. And a lot of our research studies are going to have advisors, investigators, connections, partnerships with people who represent these different stakeholder groups and areas. So what's new and different from the last time we've done this? We now, within the program announcement, have a section where some of the participating individual institutes and centers have their own specific priorities and resources that they're sharing for people who are interested in ideally having their application hosted by that institute or center. We've consolidated from prior versions the background section of the PAR, which was starting to grow longer and longer and longer, perhaps based on the fact that we had more and more participants on it. We have a heightened focus on de-implementation. We still have more that we need to do in thinking about sustainability, as well as more that we want to see in terms of applications that are focusing on the global context of health and healthcare. And then we have some revisions in terms of how the review criteria formatted. So you'll see there's the standard review criteria with those standard questions, and then underneath there's an area that says specific to this FOA and additional questions related to significance, innovation, investigator, environment, and approach that are tailored to dissemination and implementation research. These are the review criteria. So these typically, as most every NIH application is reviewed, the overall impact of the application comes down to some sort of mix of the potential impact around significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment. And we do, with that specific language, have key questions for each criterion that are relevant to dissemination and implementation research. The standing study section that sees the majority but not all of these applications is DIRH, which stands for Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health. You'll see the link at the bottom to the information about that standing committee. So because it's a standing committee, it doesn't only see applications that come from these program announcements, but over time, the vast majority of those applications that they've reviewed have really been those emanating from these three announcements. So just so folks know, all three of the forms of the announcement, the R03, the R21, and the R01, are open to foreign applications, and that means that they're applications that are conducted in foreign sites, but also applications that are conducted by investigators at institutions outside of the U.S. So NIH can make grant awards directly to foreign institutes. For the PAR, international applicants are absolutely eligible. And the argument here is that by studying something outside of the U.S., there's really a special opportunity for advancing the knowledge base. It may be because it's an unusual opportunity that we can apply research to understand better. It may be that there's some more efficiencies, that there's unusual talent or populations that would ultimately sort of be in abundance in one setting but be relevant to the U.S. context. That it can, in some way, that the findings from this research will, though, benefit the health, the well-being, health care of the U.S. population as well as the local population. So a couple of things just to remember. We encourage everybody that this is not a race, but rather, well, if it is a race, it's more of a marathon than a sprint. But you should absolutely start early, and that you should see NIH staff as an early group to try to engage with. If you are interested in an R01 where the annual direct costs are going to exceed $500,000 or more in any year, you need prior approval. So you absolutely have to be in touch. Usually it's 6 to 8 weeks or even more for the institutes and centers to be able to deal with those requests and give an okay or explain why it can't be granted. Definitely do not skimp on methods. Over time, when NIH grant applications have been evaluated, typically it's the significance and the approach sections that are the most important, and I think approach is number one. So don't do a shortcut on methods. Take advantage, although you have limited space, of being able to explain this is how we are going to answer the research questions. Demonstrate that you have partners and you have an understanding of context. You'll see this in bold, but again, talk with your program officers. And the institute contacts for the program announcement are there to answer your questions even beyond this particular webinar. If you have questions about review, Jessica Bellinger from CSR is the scientific review officer and has been very gracious in her time to make sure that all applicants are very aware of how the review is conducted, and you can ask any questions of her. I'm sure she would be very appreciative. Again, her contact information should be in the program announcements. There are general resources available. So for NIH, there's the general grants.nih.gov. There's the foreign grants specific information. Our own implementation science team at the National Cancer Institute tries to gather whatever resources possible on our website to be of help. Including information about prior dissemination and implementation grants that have been funded, different topics that you'll see. We do have links to the program announcements on our site and frequently asked questions, which we are trying to update, particularly as questions that you have might be useful to others to learn about. And then OBSSR for a long time has maintained a fair number of resources around dissemination implementation that we'll call your attention to. Again, with the institute and center specific information in the program announcements, you'll find other key links that are going to be helpful, and we'd be happy if you emailed us if you wanted more information about particular resources. So the last thing that I'm going to do before I turn it over to however many questions we have, and we will have, is just to mention a few of the key questions that we've had so far. So again, we issued these announcements in May, and so we're a few months in, and I just wanted to share a few of the questions that have come and give you a couple of brief answers, and if people want, happy to amplify them later. So one key question that has come up a lot over the years is whether the applications that are focused on HIV/AIDS related topics are reviewed in the Standing Study Committee for Dissemination, Implementation, Research, and Health, and what about international applications as well? So the latter is easier in that international applications have certainly been reviewed as they've come in to DIRH. There is a distinction, though, for HIV/AIDS applications, and that is because the deadlines are different, and it's been very hard, as I understand it, for the scientific review officers to have to try and adhere to two totally separate deadlines, meaning some of the grants might come in and be assigned to reviewers at one point, and some of them, since the HIV/AIDS ones come in expedited, have a lot less time to go out to the same reviewers. It's been hard to integrate both of those. So to this point, my understanding is that HIV/AIDS applications are reviewed in HIV/AIDS specific study sections. And so the opportunity for you to make sure that the advice that you're getting from, from program as well as review about the kind of expertise that you have on the review committee is something that you actually can enter into your cover letter. So you can put in, these are the areas of expertise within my HIV/AIDS related application, and that can help make sure that whatever review committee you go to, if it's not DIRH, has sort of suitable dissemination implementation research expertise. So can definitely answer additional questions if people have them. There was a question about whether patient demand for treatments fit within the FOA, and absolutely. When we think about dissemination and implementation research, it's not just about the continuous supply of scientifically developed interventions, but it's really about who's demanding them, and we see demand and supply coming together as the way to optimize dissemination and implementation. So that's definitely the demand side of the equation we'd love to see. Are there upcoming in-person training opportunities for D&I research at NIH? The answer is yes. So as I previously mentioned, we do have the 2016 version of our TIDER, our training institute, coming up the 2 days before our annual conference on December 14th and 15th. So the TIDER this year is the 12th and 13th. But that's already closed, and will be, for those who had applied, we'll have information about the limited number of slots soon, but this week. But on the 15th, the day after the conference, we will once again have a one-day technical assistance workshop, which is really open to anyone who submits a concept paper and wants some direct feedback from NIH staff and others. So we'd encourage, if you're coming in December and you have an idea, stay on Friday and we can work with you around getting you the appropriate feedback. To what degree is designing interventions for dissemination a part of this FOA? We would say that designing for dissemination implementation is incredibly important. If the focus of the application, though, is to get it ready to do a more traditional clinical trial, then it doesn't fit as well the FOA. So designing interventions for dissemination is certainly a topic that is congruent with the FOA, but it really comes down to, are you asking questions about whether the intervention works for the individual, or are you asking questions about how do we disseminate and implement that intervention? If it's the latter, it fits. But to that point, there's other questions that come up about hybrid effectiveness and implementation studies, and are they reviewed through this FOA? So the answer there, where you've got a study that is proposing to test the effectiveness of an intervention while also studying its implementation, where it is being tested, those kind of hybrid studies have been coming into the FOA. And the key thing there is to make sure that you truly are going to be adding to the knowledge base both around effectiveness and, for this FOA, around implementation. So they can be reviewed if you're interested in this kind of hybrid study, and that may be one where that previous question around designing interventions for dissemination and implementation comes in. It may be that you can develop a very nice hybrid study where you've designed the intervention for dissemination and implementation, and you're both testing its effectiveness and implementation. Studies do not, for this next question, have to use an RCT design, but again, it depends on what the question is and how can you most rigorously and relevantly to those involved answer that question. And then how do I find the right program officer? The first step is to take a look at the various program contacts who are listed on the program announcement. The way in which we try to do things is to have a no wrong door policy. And so if you contact me as an example and you're struggling to figure out who do I start with, I will be very happy to try and think about both at NCI but also in working with our colleagues across NIH, who would be the right handoff point. And I know that my colleagues who are listed on the program announcement typically have the same thinking. So feel free to start with that list, but if you run into any trouble, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to always be contacted by anybody. So there was just one clarification, and as I said before, around the above 500K limit, and the soliciting approval for your institute and center, there can be very clear differences between how different institutes and even divisions within those institutes are handling those requests. So in some cases, and this is why it's really important to start with your program officer, in some cases it may be even more than, it may be at least 8 weeks in advance of the particular receipt date that you get in touch and make sure that you're providing materials for the institute to be able to make a decision on that. In other cases, I know that it can be 6 weeks, but in all cases start early. So thank you, thanks Pam for that note, for that correction. Okay, so now we move on to what you want to hear about, and we have about 22 minutes left. So I think Sarah is going to run through them.
Yep, so just as a brief mention, we're going to open for questions. You can submit those questions using the Q&A feature or the chat feature, depending on how your screen's configured. That's either on the right-hand side of your screen or at the top. There's a drop-down menu, and you can select chat or Q&A from that. Go ahead and type your question in the provided field and hit submit. And with that reminder, we'll go ahead and get started. We've had a question enter the polls here that reads, the practice is well established in 5 RCTs, so there is no scientific need for a hybrid study, but the institute in question has been clear that they will not fund anything that does not evaluate clinical outcomes. Thoughts about how to best handle this?
So thanks for the question, and I think it has been another one and another reason underscoring why it's really helpful to be in touch with the individual institutes and centers that are housing the application as early as possible in the process. There are variations. So there are some institutes, as the questioner mentions, that seem to be saying, well, you know, look, we need to see that there's that tangible impact on clinical or on health outcomes. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing a hybrid study. The question that we at least like to think about is, to what degree, once the study ends, are those people who have implemented the particular intervention in a position where they themselves are also able to monitor outcomes? And it raises this opportunity to say, how, as part of our implementation strategy, might we be including some mechanism for patient outcomes to be ascertained? So just as one example of this, it doesn't necessarily mean that you change your study all that much if you feel like there really isn't as much of a need to focus on an effectiveness trial as part of your study. But there is a legitimate question to be asked about, do we need to know, because there may be variations in the patient population, there may be variations in who's delivering the intervention, or there may just be variations in the challenge that the sort of clinical or community health need over time that need to be addressed with. And so I think, and we can absolutely talk further about this, I think that there are ways that if the institute or center says we want to see some degree of clinical outcomes, you can incorporate that. It may be a sampling of a sort of sub-study to make sure that the people who are getting the intervention are doing as well as expected, or it may be something that cascades from being a part of an implementation strategy, which puts in the hands of the local site the ability to ascertain those outcomes. So hopefully that helps as a jumping off point, but definitely talk with your institutes and centers about what they would like to see.
So next up, there's a question that reads, how successful have HIV/AIDS D&I applications been going through the HIV/AIDS study section? Will this new PAR help with the success rate?
So it's a very good question, and I think and something that hopefully, I'm trying to look actually as I speak as to whether any of our colleagues who manage whether it's NIAID or NIMH to name two have might be on to weigh in. So I'm sort of taking a quick look as I go through. But, so I think the bottom line is it's a little bit harder to track. And the reason why, from my understanding, it's been a little harder to track is that it doesn't necessarily all go to one single committee. And so it goes to various committees over time. What I can say is that I know that they have been successful, but I don't know how well it equates to the sort of percentage of DIRH. Since DIRH is a standing committee, typically, as I've seen it, their success rate is about on par with the broader NIH, which is sort of somewhere between sort of 20 to 25% overall the applications that are submitted get accepted. I don't know whether the specific committees vary from that. But I think it's a good question, and that's another good thing to follow up with the program officers, because they may have some very specific guidance on which of the HIV/AIDS study sections might be most appropriate to request.
And so while we're waiting for folks to type in and submit, I apologize for the confusion on the screen. Do type your questions and submit them through the Q&A or chat function, but our website is listed there, and the recording with the Q&A from our previous session regarding this new PAR or the reissued PAR is available to you under our funding opportunity section in case you were curious and wanted to check that out.
So, okay. I feel like we should play the Jeopardy theme music right now.
Or you want to plug your Twitter? We can just banter.
That is true. We can banter, yes. And what a lovely Q&A slide this is. You have questions, we have answers. So all we're missing is the questions right now. But yeah, so while we're waiting on, just again to underscore that we've found a real nice opportunity for those of you who are newer to the field to get to know your colleagues as well as the key issues in the field at the December meeting. So this, over the last 3 years, has become a larger partnership than it was before. It used to be NIH and VA, along with AHRQ, coming together around the annual meetings. And since joining forces with Academy Health, as well as PCORI, Robert Wood Johnson, and others, it's been an even greater opportunity to kind of connect different fields. So if you haven't, I think registration is, if it's not open, it's about to open. But we're excited both to have plenary speakers who are bringing very different perspectives around innovation and around dissemination and implementation than we've seen in previous conferences. And the key topics that are going to be discussed as part of the plenaries are sustainability and de-implementation, are a fresh look at the latest in dissemination research, and then thinking about fidelity versus local adaptation. So some real key challenges that we've had, and we have some great speakers who are going to be able to frame them in terms of some of their own health system, their community, their research, or their practice experience, which would be great.
With nothing else being submitted, let's go ahead and give it another 2 minutes or so, and then we can wrap the session up early, but we do encourage you to submit your questions and or feel free to contact any of us at our provided information. Our team account, which I monitor, is the NCI-BCCPS IS team, which is displayed on your screen. You can go ahead and email there if you want to subscribe to our listserv. I'll just plug our Twitter account, which is NCI Amplify or NCI-DA Chambers, and we are certainly available to you. Perfect. Thank you, Michelle. So a question reads, in study section, have you found that investigators who implement interventions they have developed versus interventions developed by others to have an advantage in how they are reviewed?
It's a really interesting question, and I will say I have not seen a difference. I have not seen investigators have more of a problem in either case. You can see where there might be more challenges. So if somebody has developed the intervention, sometimes they may have a more difficult time in being able to articulate for those who are less familiar with the intervention about how best it can be assessed in terms of sort of the high quality, the fidelity, et cetera, that may be on the basis of, look, I wrote the manual on it, so I know it works, and that's harder to articulate. Whereas somebody who's coming with a fresh look is able to say, scientifically and empirically, what do we know about this intervention that is published, and how do we carry that forward? At the same time, those who have not had the benefit of developing and testing that intervention may not know as much. So I haven't seen a difference, but I think it's a really interesting question. And either way, it's really important that the teams that you're developing for these studies have the expertise in understanding the intervention, who have the expertise in understanding dissemination and implementation, have the expertise in really understanding the context in which the different interventions are being delivered. It's not the easiest thing to try and construct that team, but I think I find that the teams that have the varied expertise referenced are do better than those that don't. So I would say the team approach seems to work better, but I haven't seen a difference if you're trying to implement your own versus someone else's.
So I'm going to go ahead and ask and answer the next question, which is an archive available or can slides be given? Go ahead and email our email address displayed, the NCI DCCPS-IS team at mail.nih.gov if you're interested in a copy of today's slide deck. And I'm anticipating an archive of today's webinar to be available on our website, also listed in about 1 week. And so our next question, unrelated to archiving, reads, for those thinking ahead to potentially renewing grants funded previously under DIRH PAR, any advice specific to DIRH? What would justify a renewal application as compared to a new application?
So that's a really great question, this issue of renewal versus a new application. And I think, the renewal, we have seen, first of all, we have seen renewal applications come through DIRH and been funded. So it's not at all to say that it is not able to be done. I think the key thing is to say to what degree is the next application clearly progressing from what you've done in that earlier phase. And so one example of where it's been pretty logical for reviewers to understand is if in that initial phase you're focusing on implementation, and then when you come back you're thinking about those latter term issues around sustainability, de-implementation, or adaptation. And that's actually a couple of the prototypical examples. But I think in terms of renewal versus new applications, it's just a broader question to say, has it really been the findings from this initial stage that have compelled you to move in this next logical direction? I've seen people feel like there's enough separation that they want to go in for a new application. When you do have a renewal, the benefit that you have is that you have that extra space in the application to give a progress report of what you've been able to accomplish. So I think it comes down to a case-by-case basis, but that's something that I think on the individual case, program officers can be quite good at helping you with.
Great. So does DIRH review K applications?
So as a standing committee, they are able to not just review R01s, R03s, R21s, and we have seen them review K applications in the past. I would absolutely, just because it's always in your advantage, to make sure that your information is up to date. And so that's a good question just to follow up with Jessica Bellinger and make sure that there aren't any changes. But yes, certainly in recent years, they have reviewed K applications. And those are the ones that are typically focused on dissemination implementation research.
Great. So we can wait another moment and see if any other questions drop in.
Great questions, by the way. So thank you.
So it looks like we're going to wrap up a few minutes early. We encourage you to email us if you have any lingering questions or unanswered thoughts. Go ahead and send us a note. We will be posting the archive in approximately 2 weeks on our website. The archive availability will be announced through our newsletter and via Twitter. Thank you for joining us for today's session. You may disconnect at this time.